On the night of 30 November 1942, off Tassafaronga on the northern coast of Guadalcanal, the Imperial Japanese Navy delivered one of the most punishing torpedo attacks the United States Navy had yet experienced in the Pacific. Rear Admiral Reizo Tanaka's force of destroyers, running another high-speed resupply mission down what Americans had begun calling the Tokyo Express, met a stronger American surface force under Rear Admiral Carleton H. Wright. On paper, the Americans held the advantage. They had radar. They had more guns. They believed they were attacking from a position of control, yet within minutes that confidence dissolved into fire, wreckage, and confusion. Japanese Type 93 oxygen torpedoes tore into the American formation. USS Northampton was lost. Minneapolis, New Orleans, and Pensacola were badly damaged. In battle after battle through 1942, American officers had still not fully understood what the Japanese had put to sea: a torpedo with extraordinary range, great speed, and a warhead heavy enough to break the back of a cruiser. From the Japanese point of view, there was nothing mysterious about the result. This was precisely what their night-fighting doctrine had promised. Long before the war, the Imperial Japanese Navy had built a tactical system around darkness, surprise, disciplined torpedo attack, and the expectation that one violent underwater blow could decide a surface action before gunnery ever finished the job. Against cruisers and destroyers alike, that doctrine had worked with devastating effect in the opening phase of the Pacific War. At Savo Island, at Tassafaronga, and in repeated night actions around the Solomons, American ships were hit at ranges American commanders had not thought possible. Some officers even assumed the torpedoes must have come from submarines, because they did not believe destroyers and cruisers could launch effective spreads from so far away. And yet, as 1943 and 1944 unfolded, something emerged that Japanese commanders had far less reason to expect. American destroyers were still getting hit, some were still being crippled, some still sank, but others did something increasingly important. They survived. They stayed afloat after damage that should have finished them. They were patched, towed, strengthened, rebuilt, and sent back into the war. The question was not why torpedoes failed. Japanese torpedoes remained among the most lethal naval weapons of the war. The deeper question was why those torpedo hits did not always achieve their larger strategic purpose against the United States Navy. Why did American destroyers, even after catastrophic underwater damage, keep returning to the line? The answer was not a single invention. It was not one admiral, one ship class, or one dramatic battlefield improvisation. It was a system. It was the combined effect of hard lessons, technical design, institutional self-correction, disciplined damage control training, and a repair structure so large and so adaptable that even severe combat damage did not automatically translate into permanent loss. Japanese admirals were not facing a single American ship that happened to be unusually lucky. They were facing an industrial navy that was learning, compartment by compartment and battle by battle, how to absorb punishment and continue the war. To understand that difference, it is necessary to go back before Guadalcanal, before the Tokyo Express, and even before Pearl Harbor, to the interwar decades when the two navies prepared for a conflict both believed would come across the Pacific. The Imperial Japanese Navy entered the 20th century with an institutional belief in the decisive fleet battle. That doctrine evolved, but its core logic remained recognizable. The United States battle fleet, it was assumed, would steam westward across the Pacific. Along the way, submarines, aircraft, cruisers, and destroyers would weaken it. Then, near Japan's home waters, the combined fleet would destroy what remained in a final encounter. Torpedoes were central to that vision. They were not auxiliary weapons. They were a way to redress Japan's numerical disadvantage. The Type 93 torpedo embodied that effort. Developed in secrecy and known after the war by the nickname Long Lance, it was larger, faster, and longer range than any torpedo the U.S. Navy expected Japan to possess. It was a 24-inch weapon carrying a warhead of roughly 1,080 pounds. It could reach extraordinarily long distances for its day, on the order of 12 nautical miles at about 50 knots or much farther at lower speed. In practice, Japanese surface forces often employed it from about 6 to 11 nautical miles. That alone upset American assumptions. U.S. torpedoes were generally expected to be used at much shorter ranges, often within about 5 nautical miles. The Japanese weapon also used compressed oxygen rather than compressed air, reducing the visible wake that might otherwise warn a target ship. At night, in confused action, that mattered. Ships could be hit before they even understood that torpedoes were in the water. The most striking part of the story is that the United States had warning. In 1940, a Japanese walk-in source gave the U.S. naval attaché in Tokyo information on the Type 93. Office of Naval Intelligence passed the report onward. but the Bureau of Ordnance dismissed it. The reasoning was revealing. American officials did not think the Japanese had developed a torpedo superior to their own, and they considered compressed oxygen too dangerous for practical use aboard warships. The intelligence was accurate, the institutional reaction was not. That failure mattered at a terrible cost. According to the Navy's later historical assessment, more than 3,100 American sailors died because the United States Navy did not understand and did not prepare for Japanese night torpedo capabilities and tactics. At first, the Japanese expectation that a torpedo strike could effectively end a destroyer's fight was not irrational. Destroyers were small warships. They were fast, comparatively lightly built, and packed tightly with machinery, fuel, weapons, and men. Their hulls did not have the mass or armor of battleships. A major underwater explosion could break structure, wreck propulsion, flood machinery spaces, detonate ready ammunition, or simply tear away a bow or stern. In the early Pacific battles, torpedo damage frequently did exactly that. The U.S. Navy's own wartime destroyer damage report, covering the period from October 1941 to December 1944, makes the larger picture unmistakable. More than 100 U.S. destroyers were damaged by enemy weapons larger than 40mm projectiles. 44 were lost as a result of the damage they incurred. 31 destroyers were torpedoed, and only 7 of those were saved. 8 were damaged by mines, and 5 survived. Those are not statistics of invulnerability. They are statistics of attrition in a brutal war. But those same numbers also reveal something else. 7 torpedoed destroyers did survive. 5 mine destroyers survived, and the report drew attention to a fact that challenged easy assumptions about why destroyers were lost. Of the 44 destroyers sunk by enemy action in the period studied, only 2 were clear-cut cases in which loss of stability followed by capsizing was the major factor. In other words, destroyers were not simply toppling over because they were too small or too unstable to endure damage. Loss often depended on specific combinations of flooding, structural damage, fire, and the ship's ability, or inability, to control the situation before it cascaded beyond recovery. That distinction points directly to the central issue. A torpedo hit was not merely an explosion. It was a contest between the violence of blast and the organization of the ship that received it. The hull form mattered, the internal subdivision mattered, the layout of boilers, engines, fuel lines, generators, pumps, and electrical runs mattered. The quality of steelwork mattered. The speed with which hatches were shut, hoses laid out, shoring erected, and flooding boundaries established mattered. The ability to keep even partial propulsion, even emergency power, even one fire main, could determine whether a destroyer was a wreck to be abandoned or a casualty to be saved. By the later stages of the war, the U.S. Navy had become much better at that contest. The destroyer damage report explicitly attributed improved resistance in newer 2,100 and 2,200-ton destroyers to better watertight subdivision, greater longitudinal strength, and an arrangement of machinery that allowed operation with a completely split plant. That phrase, dry as it sounds, is one of the keys to the entire story. A split plant meant that machinery was not concentrated in a single vulnerable block. Boiler rooms and engine rooms were arranged so that one hit, or even flooding through multiple connected spaces, would not necessarily leave the ship entirely dead. It did not make a destroyer torpedo-proof. Nothing could do that. But it increased the odds that some propulsion, some generating capacity, some pumping capability, and some control could survive. The concept of longitudinal strength was equally important. A destroyer hit by a heavy torpedo, especially in the middle half of its length, could suffer a sharp reduction in what naval architects describe as section modulus, the hull's capacity to resist bending loads. In simple terms, a torpedo could turn a warship into something structurally closer to a badly broken beam than an intact vessel. Once that happened, the sea itself became the next enemy. Even if the initial flooding was controlled, heavy weather, wave action, speed, or towing stresses could cause the ship to sag, hog, crack, or part entirely. Survival therefore depended not only on stopping water, but on preserving enough structural continuity for the ship to remain a ship. USS O'Brien demonstrated that lesson in harsh detail. On 15 September 1942, while screening a carrier force in the South Pacific during the same submarine attack that also struck USS Wasp and damaged USS North Carolina, O'Brien was hit by a Japanese torpedo in the extreme bow. She did not sink immediately. The visible damage seemed limited compared with what had happened to larger ships elsewhere in the campaign. She remained afloat and began the long movement away from the combat zone, yet the damage was deceptive. Hidden structural injury had spread farther than the first inspection suggested. As the ship continued under her own power over long distances and through ocean swell, those unseen weaknesses worsened. On 19 October 1942, more than a month after the hit, O'Brien broke apart and was lost. O'Brien's story is important because it illustrates both the limits and the value of American survivability. The torpedo had not killed her outright. Initial buoyancy, crew action, and ship design had prevented immediate loss, but survival after the first hour was not enough. The U.S. Navy had to learn how blast could travel stress into the hull, how plating and framing could be weakened beyond the obvious wound, and how a ship that seemed saved in port could still be doomed at sea if structural repair did not match structural reality. O'Brien was a warning that partial survival without complete understanding could become a delayed sinking. The U.S. Navy learned from cases like that with unusual institutional seriousness. Reports were written, patterns were compared, repair methods were standardized, training expanded. This is one of the least glamorous but most consequential differences in the Pacific Naval War. The Americans converted damage into data and data into revised practice. The process was not perfect, it was not immediate, but it was relentless. That process can be seen even more clearly in the destroyers that survived what looked, at first glance, unsurvivable. One of the most striking examples was USS Selfridge at the Battle of Vella Le Vella on the night of 6-7 October 1943. By then, the tactical situation in the Solomons had begun to change. American commanders were improving the use of radar, destroyer tactics were evolving, and the Japanese were increasingly being forced to evacuate isolated positions rather than reinforce them. Yet the Long Lance remained deadly, and Japanese destroyer crews remained skilled opponents in night combat. During the action off Vella Le Vella, Selfridge was struck in the bow by a torpedo. The damage was catastrophic. Nearly 100 feet of the forward section were severed. 49 sailors were lost. In most intuitive understandings of a destroyer's vulnerability, that should have been the end of the ship. A warship missing such a section of hull should not be expected to survive the night, much less return to duty. And yet Selfridge did survive. The U.S. Navy's own destroyer damage study later emphasized the case because it showed something technically significant. After the bow of Selfridge had been blown off, the hull still exhibited no signs of failure despite making about 10 knots. That is an extraordinary observation. It means the remaining structure retained enough integrity to carry sea loads despite grotesque local destruction. Why did that matter to Japanese expectations? Because a Long Lance hit had done what it was designed to do. It had caused massive local damage, it had inflicted heavy casualties. It had torn away an entire forward section, but it had not converted tactical success into total loss. The ship stayed afloat. Emergency actions preserved what could be preserved. Temporary repairs made further movement possible. Additional repair work followed. Selfridge reached Pearl Harbor in February 1944 and shortly afterward moved on for permanent repair work. In time, she was back in service and participating again in Pacific operations. For a Navy accustomed to treating torpedo attack as a decisive tactical instrument, that outcome was strategically frustrating. The destroyer that should have been erased from the order of battle had merely been removed, repaired, and returned. It is worth pausing on what returned actually meant in the American system. It did not mean a miracle in the abstract. It meant trained repair parties aboard ship. It meant officers and men who knew how to stabilize a casualty under combat conditions. It meant tenders, advanced bases, and dockyards capable of fabricating structures, replacing wrecked sections, and moving damaged vessels through a repair pipeline. It meant the Bureau of Ships, naval yards, contractors, welders, riveters, shipfitters, pipefitters, electricians, and planners who could treat battle damage not as a unique catastrophe every time, but as a recurring engineering problem to be solved at scale. The U.S. Navy's destroyer report concluded that war experience had shown the importance of limiting and reducing flooding above all. That sounds self-evident, but the technical implications are substantial. Flooding is not only about the volume of water entering the ship. It is about where that water enters, whether it communicates with adjacent spaces, whether free surface effects reduce stability, whether submerged openings allow progressive spread, whether pumps remain powered, and whether the hull's damaged shape subjects internal bulkheads to pressures they were never designed to withstand. The report suggested that, in combination with severe structural weakening, the practical upper limit of survivable flooding was somewhat greater than 2 machinery spaces for smaller destroyers and somewhat greater than 3 machinery spaces for larger ones. That was not theoretical speculation. It was derived from battle experience. So when an American destroyer stayed alive after a torpedo hit, it was usually because a series of thresholds had not all been crossed at once. The blast had not destroyed every vital service. Flooding had been bounded before it became general. Structural damage, though severe, had not progressed into complete breakup. Fire had not reached magazines. Repair parties had acted quickly enough to preserve pumps, shore bulkheads, rig emergency systems, or prepare the hull for towing and patching. Survival was not luck alone, it was the management of thresholds. There was also a tactical dimension to this story. In 1942, American surface forces were often fighting Japanese destroyers and cruisers under conditions Japan had studied for years and the United States had not yet mastered. The Japanese excelled in night optics, lookout training, and coordinated torpedo doctrine. American radar offered enormous potential, but potential is not the same as mature doctrine. Misjudged ranges, premature gunfire, poor formation handling, and incomplete appreciation of enemy torpedo envelopes repeatedly cost the United States ships in the Solomons. Tassafaronga was the clearest warning, but not the only one. By 1943, however, American destroyer commanders were beginning to combine radar with disciplined torpedo tactics of their own. At Vela Gulf in August 1943, Commander Frederick Moosbrugger led U.S. destroyers in a night torpedo attack that sank multiple Japanese destroyers and demonstrated how effectively radar could support offensive destroyer action when commanders used it with patience and clarity. That did not make Japanese torpedoes obsolete, nor did it eliminate American losses, but it changed the tactical exchange. The Japanese were increasingly meeting an enemy that not only survived damage better, but also fought more intelligently before damage occurred. That matters because Japanese admirals had built their expectations from a very different run of experience. In the first phase of the war, their destroyers and cruisers had often struck first, vanished into darkness, and left American ships sinking. The Type 93's range and power appeared to confirm the underlying doctrine. If a torpedo attack could remove heavy enemy units early in an engagement, then tactical economy favored the attacker. A destroyer's job was to hit first and hit hard, not to endure prolonged, industrialized cycles of damage and repair. The psychological assumption behind decisive night torpedo warfare was that destruction, once achieved, stayed achieved. The American system increasingly violated that assumption. This is not to say that U.S. destroyers became invulnerable or that Japanese commanders were irrational. Many American destroyers did not survive. The war damage report is explicit on that point. Torpedoes remain the primary cause of loss for many of the ships studied. The Japanese Type 93 retained its capacity to wreck destroyers, cruisers, and even contribute to the final sinking of major ships such as Hornet. What changed was the average meaning of a torpedo hit against the United States Navy over time. Early in the war, a hit often translated into immediate removal from the campaign. Later, increasingly, a hit could mean temporary loss followed by return. The institutional side of that transformation deserves close attention. Pearl Harbor had already forced the U.S. Navy to confront modern battle damage in its most violent form. Coral Sea, Midway, and the Solomons deepened those lessons. Firefighting schools expanded. Repair organizations matured. Damage control procedures became part of routine operational culture, not an emergency specialty remembered only when the ship was already burning. In war at sea, this is a form of doctrine every bit as real as torpedo tactics. A navy teaches not only how to attack, but how to remain a functioning instrument after being attacked. American destroyer crews became steadily better at that second task. There was also the matter of scale. The United States possessed not simply shipyards, but a continental industrial base and a navy capable of moving damaged ships through multiple stages of recovery. A destroyer could receive emergency stabilization in a forward area, more comprehensive work at a major base such as Pearl Harbor, and permanent rebuilding at a West Coast yard. That sequence converted battlefield survival into restored combat power. A torpedo hit that destroyed bow structure, wrecked compartments, or knocked out machinery did not necessarily become a final accounting. It became an engineering schedule. Selfridge is the clearest expression of that principle, but she was not alone. The destroyer damage study cited successful survival efforts in ships such as Hambleton and Abner Reed, cases that involved underwater damage of different kinds but reinforced the same lesson. Effective compartmentation and prompt damage control could preserve a ship the enemy believed already finished. Even where the initial mode of damage was a mine rather than a torpedo, the underlying problem, massive local structural destruction combined with flooding and the risk of progressive loss, was closely related. The lesson generalized across weapon types because it was really about the ship's ability to remain structurally and organizationally coherent after shock. That coherence also depended on design philosophy. The U.S. report noted that increased destroyer size contributed significantly to resistance. A somewhat larger hull provides not just extra displacement but more options. Bulkheads can be placed more effectively. Machinery can be separated more intelligently. Reserve buoyancy improves. Structural members can be more robust without ruining speed and endurance. The difference between an older destroyer and a newer one was not cosmetic. It could decide whether the ship failed after one catastrophic compartment loss or retained enough margin for the crew to fight for her. This is one reason the Pacific War cannot be understood solely through the drama of single engagements. There is always a temptation to see a night battle as a self-contained episode of tactics and heroism, but below that level lies naval administration, design, logistics, procurement, training, and forensic reporting. The ship that survives in darkness often owes its future not only to courage on the night of impact, but to decisions made years earlier in bureau offices and yards. How bulkheads were arranged, how piping systems were duplicated, how crew drills were written, how repair ships were deployed, how reports were circulated, how defects were acknowledged rather than denied. That last point is especially revealing in comparison with torpedo development itself. The U.S. Navy entered the war with severe torpedo problems of its own. Its submarine, air, and surface torpedoes repeatedly failed in combat. The Bureau of Ordnance resisted complaints from the fleet. It took extensive pressure and operational testing before major defects were admitted and corrected. In this sense, the United States had its own institutional blind spots. It underestimated the Japanese torpedo, and it overestimated its own. But where the United States eventually showed decisive strength was in its capacity to reverse itself. Bad assumptions did not disappear quickly, but they did not remain permanent doctrine. By late 1944, American torpedoes had become far more effective weapons. By then, even more importantly for destroyer survivability, the Navy that had stumbled through the Solomons had become a Navy that learned faster than its enemy. That learning curve altered the operational balance in the Pacific. Early Japanese night actions had imposed a tactical and psychological burden disproportionate even to the ships sunk. If a force commander believes that any destroyer contact after dark might bring unseen torpedoes from impossible range, the effect on maneuver, aggression, and confidence is profound. Once American commanders better understood Japanese capabilities, improved radar use, refined torpedo employment, and relied on crews trained to manage battle damage, the asymmetry narrowed. Japanese destroyers remained formidable, but they no longer operated against an enemy who would predictably misunderstand the fight. This helps explain why the title question points toward admirals rather than individual sailors. Destroyer survival mattered beyond the fate of one hull. Admirals think in terms of campaign arithmetic. A sunk destroyer is gone. A disabled destroyer that returns months later still counts in future screens, escorts, bombardments, rescue operations, anti-submarine patrols, radar pickets, and amphibious assaults. By 1943 and 1944, the United States was fighting not only with the ships it launched that year, but with ships the enemy had already believed destroyed or effectively removed. That changes force ratios over time. It changes planning. It changes the value of each successful attack. For Japan, this was particularly severe because the destroyer was one of the war's most overburdened ship types. Japanese destroyers were expected to screen battle forces, deliver torpedo attack, escort carriers and convoys, run troops and supplies to island garrisons, evacuate soldiers, conduct bombardment, and fight night actions. Every destroyer lost was a tactical and logistical subtraction. Every American destroyer restored was a multiplication of endurance on the other side. In a long war of attrition, survivability is inseparable from production and repair. The irony is that the Type 93 remained a superb weapon even as the strategic environment around it deteriorated. Technically, it was still one of the finest torpedoes of the war. Operationally, it still posed lethal danger, but no weapon exists outside its system. A torpedo can break steel. It cannot by itself overcome a rival navy's ability to learn, repair, and replace. Japanese doctrine had been built around decisive effects. The American war effort gradually turned those effects into temporary setbacks more often than Japan could afford. There is another level to this story, and it is the human one. Damage control language can sound mechanical, but every successful case rested on men acting under extreme pressure. In a destroyer after a torpedo hit, the environment could become instantly disorienting. Lighting failed, steam escaped, compartments flooded, bulkheads groaned, communications broke, fires threatened fuel and ammunition. Men disappeared with whole sections of the ship. The choice to keep the ship alive depended on officers and enlisted sailors who could still think systematically while the structure around them was partially gone. Closing valves, isolating circuits, rigging pumps, manning hoses, jettisoning topweight when necessary, reinforcing weakened boundaries, caring for wounded shipmates while still preserving the vessel. These were not abstractions. They were actions taken in darkness, heat, and fear. It is precisely because those actions were disciplined rather than theatrical that they mattered historically. The American destroyer force did not solve torpedo vulnerability by discovering a secret armor scheme or a miracle weapon. It solved it imperfectly but effectively by turning damage control into combat power. A torpedo hit became one more phase of battle to be fought rather than an automatic conclusion. That mental shift is one of the great, quiet transformations of the Pacific Naval War. By the end of 1944, the cumulative record was unmistakable. The U.S. Navy's own reports showed both the scale of loss and the scale of adaptation. More than 100 destroyers had taken serious punishment. 44 had been lost, 31 had been torpedoed, yet 7 had been saved. Those 7 were not statistical curiosities. They were proof that the relationship between torpedo hit and ship loss was not fixed. It could be altered by design, by preparation, by training, and by repair doctrine. That conclusion may sound modest compared with the epic language often used about great sea battles, but strategically it was profound. It also had a legacy beyond destroyers. The wartime U.S. emphasis on survivability, distributed systems, firefighting, compartmentation, repair party discipline, and honest post-damage analysis fed directly into post-war naval standards. Modern warship design still reflects the assumption that damage is not an exception but a design condition. Certification regimes, damage control training, redundant systems, firefighting doctrine, and survivability engineering in later U.S. naval practice all owe something to the lessons written in the Pacific between 1942 and 1945. The principle is not limited to warships. It appears across engineering fields, in aviation, in offshore structures, in industrial safety, in every complex system where graceful degradation matters more than ideal performance on a perfect day. That is why the story is larger than Japanese admirals and American destroyers. It is really about two different ways of understanding combat effectiveness. One measures effectiveness by the immediate violence of the blow. The other measures it by the ability to remain functional after being hit. Japan excelled in the first category, especially at the beginning. The United States became exceptionally strong in the second. Over time, the second quality proved more durable. When historians look back at the Pacific War, it is easy to let the great names dominate the narrative. Midway, Guadalcanal, Leyte Gulf, Yamamoto, Halsey, Spruance. But naval history is also decided by what happens after the explosion, in the hour when a crew either stabilizes a ruined hull or abandons it to the sea. The destroyer force of the United States Navy gradually became one of the most effective schools in the world at fighting that second battle. The evidence lies in ships like O'Brien, which taught bitter lessons, in Selfridge, which showed what a well-designed and well-handled destroyer could endure, and in the Navy-wide reporting system that translated catastrophe into improved practice. So why could Japanese admirals not easily understand how American destroyers kept fighting after torpedo hits? Because the question itself emerged from a mismatch of assumptions. Japanese torpedo doctrine assumed, with good reason at first, that a destroyer struck hard enough would be finished as a fighting instrument. American experience slowly made that assumption less reliable. A torpedo could still maim, it could still kill, it could still sink. But against a Navy that emphasized watertight subdivision, longitudinal strength, split machinery plants, disciplined damage control, and an enormous repair network, a torpedo hit increasingly failed to guarantee permanent removal. In the end, the ocean remained merciless to small warships. No destroyer captain mistook survival for invulnerability. The Pacific was littered with the remains of ships that never came home. But the destroyers that did survive helped reveal one of the most important truths of 20th century naval warfare. Lethality alone does not decide a campaign. Survival has to be organized. Endurance has to be engineered. A navy wins not only by striking harder, but by remaining in the fight after being struck. And that is the real answer hidden inside those shattered bows and flooded machinery spaces. The United States Navy did not defeat the Long Lance by making torpedoes harmless. It defeated the strategic promise of the Long Lance by refusing to let every successful hit become a final result. In the dark waters off Guadalcanal, at Vela La Vela, and across the Pacific, that distinction changed the war. Even when Japanese torpedoes broke steel exactly as intended, They were increasingly hitting ships that belonged to a system built to absorb disaster, learn from it, repair it, and return to sea. That is why the destroyers kept fighting, not because the torpedoes were weak, but because the Navy behind those destroyers had become stronger than the blow.